In the landscape of human psychology, this is the reality of the super empath. They possess an extraordinary capacity for what we call effective empathy, the ability to physically and emotionally mirror the internal states of the people around them. When you hurt, they feel the biological echo of your pain. Because of this, people often make a critical, often fatal miscalculation. They mistake this profound capacity for grace as a lack of sight. They assume that because an empath chooses to understand, an empath can be tricked. But there is a distinct line where emotional intelligence shifts from gentle understanding to fierce clinical self-preservation. There is one specific psychological boundary, a single emotional betrayal that changes the neurochemistry of the relationship permanently. When this line is crossed, something fascinating happens inside the super empath's emotional architecture. The warmth doesn't just cool down, it vanishes. The open door doesn't just crack shut, it evaporates as if it were never there. Most people spend months, even years, trying to figure out why an empath suddenly went cold. They look at the last argument, the last disagreement, missing the quiet, calculated shift that happened weeks prior. If you have ever wondered why a deeply caring person can suddenly treat someone like a total stranger, or if you want to ensure you never accidentally trigger this irreversible detachment in your own relationships, you need to understand the hidden mechanics of the super empath's breaking point. Because once that switch is flipped, no amount of apology, no amount of charm, and no level of regret can ever turn it back on. We often view empathy as a form of soft vulnerability, a gentle, passive absorbing of the world's friction. But true emotional intelligence reveals that the highest form of empathy is not weak. It is incredibly perceptive. Within the spectrum of human personality, the super empath represents an individual who has synthesized deep emotional intuition with sharp cognitive awareness. They see the hidden architectural flaws in human behavior. They see the pain behind the anger, the insecurity behind the arrogance. But today, we need to address a profound misunderstanding that regularly occurs in social dynamics. Because super empaths extend immense amounts of emotional credit to others, toxic personalities assume their patience is bottomless. This is a dangerous psychological blind spot. There is one specific calculated emotional mistake that a super empath will never forgive. If you understand this one concept, you will understand the true boundary of emotional intelligence, and you will discover exactly why a super empath's exit is always absolute, silent, and permanent. To understand the breaking point, we must first look at how a super empath operates. In standard social interactions, most people practice selective empathy. A super empath, however, possesses an incredibly active mirror neuron system. They don't just intellectually recognize your distress. They experience a microdose of it within their own nervous system. When a relationship experiences friction, whether it is a friendship, a romance, or a professional partnership, the super empath will naturally use their cognitive empathy to justify the other person's shortcomings. They think they are acting out because they are stressed or they are projecting their past trauma. This is what we call emotional accommodation. They will give you chances that standard logic says you do not deserve purely because they can see the wounded child behind your adult armor. This accommodation creates an illusion. The manipulator looks at this repeated forgiveness and concludes that this person has no boundaries and that they can bend them indefinitely. But they are misreading the data. The empath isn't forgiving because they are blind. They are forgiving because they are choosing to give the relationship every possible biological chance to self-correct. This brings us to the mistake that seals the fate of the relationship. It is not an outburst of rage. It is not a moment of thoughtless selfishness. It is the moment of calculated emotional manipulation after explicit communication. When a super empath realizes a boundary is being crossed, their high emotional intelligence compels them to do something very clear. They will articulate the boundary. They will not play games. They will sit you down and tell you that when you do this, it drains their ecosystem, that it hurts them, and they cannot allow it. They lay their emotional blueprints completely bare. The unpardonable mistake happens next. The manipulator, seeing this vulnerability, takes that explicit blueprint and uses it to construct a more targeted attack. They use the empath's open honesty to gaslight them, turning the empath's own sensitivity against them by claiming they are just too sensitive or imagining things while deliberately continuing the toxic behavior. This is the exact moment the relationship dies. Why? Because the superempath realizes that the hurt being inflicted on them is no longer accidental. It is no longer a byproduct of the other person's unhealed trauma. It is a conscious, strategic choice to exploit their capacity to care. When this threshold is crossed, a fascinating psychological mechanism takes over. In behavioral science, we talk about emotional self-regulation, the ability to manage our internal state so we aren't hijacked by our impulses. While the standard response to betrayal might involve screaming, crying, or seeking revenge, the super-empath's high self-regulation manifests as a chilling absolute detachment. This is often referred to in psychological circles as the empath nova. The warmth doesn't just fade, the emotional circuit breaker trips. The super-empath instantly recalculates the value of the relationship and realizes that continuing to invest emotional capital is a threat to their own psychological survival. They do not argue. They do not yell. They do not give a grand speech about why they are leaving. They simply become a ghost in your life. If they are forced to interact with you logistically, they employ what is known as the gray rock method, becoming as emotionally uninspiring, flat, and unresponsive as a pebble on the ground. You no longer have access to their energy because they have realized you do not possess the emotional maturity to handle it safely. The ultimate lesson of the superempath is a masterclass in emotional intelligence. It reminds us that empathy without boundaries is not love. It is self-sabotage. A superempath forgives 1,000 genuine mistakes born from human frailty, but they will never forgive the deliberate weaponization of their own kindness. They understand that their capacity to feel deeply is a rare, valuable currency in a cold world, and they refuse to spend it on someone who uses it to buy their destruction. Let this be a reminder to all of us in our social ecosystems. Value the people who take the time to understand your silence. Treasure those who offer you unearned grace, but never mistake their patience for blindness. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to a deeply empathetic person is force them to show you how well they can survive without you. The human brain is fundamentally wired for connection, operating via an intricate web of neural pathways designed to echo the emotional states of those around us. In the study of emotional intelligence, we recognize this as the mirror neuron system, the biological architecture that allows us to perceive, map, and internalize another person's grief, joy, or anxiety. Within the broader spectrum of human psychology, most individuals experience this on a conditional or fluctuating basis. However, the individual known as the superempath possesses a neural mirroring system that operates at an exceptionally heightened frequency. They do not merely observe the emotional climate of a room. They absorb it, decoding microexpressions, shifts in vocal cadence, and unexpressed tensions with startling accuracy. For many years, traditional behavioral models viewed this extreme sensitivity as a profound vulnerability, assuming that to feel everything so acutely meant lacking the psychological armor required to withstand the friction of interpersonal conflict. This assumption, however, misses a crucial evolutionary distinction between basic emotional contagion and advanced emotional intelligence. The defining characteristic of a superempath is not the intensity of their feelings, but the sophisticated integration of effective empathy with sharp cognitive empathy and unyielding emotional boundaries. While effective empathy allows them to instinctively feel what you feel, cognitive empathy grants them the intellectual detachment necessary to understand why you feel it, allowing them to map your psychological motivations without becoming lost in them. When high emotional intelligence reaches maturity, it ceases to be a passive sponge and instead becomes an active, highly perceptive radar system. This system is supported by an internal psychological framework that understands a fundamental truth of human dynamics. An open heart without a protective gate is not an asset to a social ecosystem. It is a liability. Consequently, the blueprint of a super empath is rooted in a paradox of deep vulnerability and clinical self-preservation. They extend immense amounts of emotional credit, utilizing their cognitive insight to grant others grace for their flaws, traumas, and momentary lapses in judgment. They can look past an outburst of anger to see the underlying fear driving it, or dissect an act of selfishness to reveal the insecurity beneath. Yet, this deep understanding is never a sign of blind compliance. The superempath maintains a clear internal boundary line that separates their own emotional identity from the toxicity of others. They recognize that their energy is a finite, valuable resource that must be managed with high self-regulation. When operating in their full power, they do not absorb negativity to their own detriment. Instead, they observe it with objective analytical clarity. This unique synthesis creates an individual who is simultaneously the most compassionate presence in a room and the most fiercely protective guardian of their own psychological peace. They offer a rare level of emotional safety to those who operate with mutual respect, but they do so with the full awareness that their capacity to connect is a privilege extended to others, not an open invitation for exploitation. To misinterpret their patience as a lack of boundaries is a profound psychological error. Because the very same neurocomplexity that allows them to love without measure is what equips them to evaluate a relationship's health with absolute unwavering objectivity. To truly comprehend the breaking point of this dynamic, we must dissect the precise anatomy of the transgression that shatters it. In the realm of interpersonal psychology, relationships naturally experience various forms of friction, outbursts of anger, moments of thoughtless selfishness, or lapses in judgment born from stress and human frailty. A superempath equipped with high emotional intelligence views these standard infractions through a lens of cognitive empathy. They possess the psychological maturity to look past the immediate behavior and recognize the underlying cause, whether it is a bad day or unhealed childhood trauma. Because they can accurately map the source of your pain, they extend an extraordinary amount of emotional credit for giving errors that others might instantly reject. However, a catastrophic miscalculation occurs when a manipulative individual mistakes this profound patience for blindness or a lack of personal agency. The one mistake a super empath will never forgive is not a spontaneous emotional mistake. It is the deliberate, calculated weaponization of their own empathy against them, executed after explicit boundaries have been clearly communicated. In a healthy social ecosystem, when a boundary is crossed, individuals engage in open dialogue to recalibrate the relationship. The superempath excels at this, laying their emotional blueprints entirely bare with absolute honesty and vulnerability. They will sit you down and explicitly articulate their limits, saying exactly what hurts them, what drains their psychological ecosystem, and what behaviors they cannot tolerate. This act of transparent communication is a test of mutual respect and emotional maturity. The unpardonable transgression occurs when the manipulator takes that exact blueprint, the very map of the empath's vulnerabilities, and uses it not to modify their behavior, but to construct a more targeted, strategic, emotional attack. This manifests as intentional gaslighting, where the manipulator systematically alters the narrative to make the empath doubt their own reality, using phrases like "you are just too sensitive" or "you are imagining things" to invalidate the very boundaries that were just established. This is a profound violation of psychological safety because it transforms the harm from an accidental byproduct of human ignorance into a conscious, premeditated choice to exploit another person's capacity to care. It is a malicious utilization of emotional data where the manipulator counts on the empath's natural tendency to forgive and accommodate in order to continue the toxic behavior without consequence. The moment the super empath recognizes this calculated pattern, the entire architecture of the relationship undergoes an irreversible shift. They realize that they are no longer dealing with someone who is merely struggling with their own emotional regulation, but rather someone who actively uses the empath's kindness as a tool for subjugation. This crosses a psychological line of no return because it attacks the very foundation of trust and empathy itself. For a super empath whose entire life is built upon the sacred nature of deep human connection, treating that connection with calculated malice is the ultimate betrayal. It is a direct assault on their psychological survival. And no amount of subsequent charm, superficial apologies, or strategic love bombing can ever repair the breach, because the illusion of the other person's fundamental goodness has been permanently dissolved under the cold light of objective reality. When the threshold of calculated manipulation is crossed, the response of a super empath departs entirely from standard behavioral patterns, moving away from classic trauma bonding loops and entering the realm of high-level emotional self-regulation. In typical interpersonal disruptions, a betrayal or severe boundary violation often triggers a volatile emotional storm. Most people experience an immediate state of emotional hijacking, resulting in loops of confrontation, tearful ultimatums, or cycles of anxious pursuit and defensive withdrawal. This chaotic feedback loop is precisely what a manipulative personality relies upon. They feed on the emotional reaction, recognizing that as long as the other person is angry, devastated, or attempting to fix the breach, they remain deeply invested and psychically tied to the dynamic. Super empath, however, utilizes their advanced emotional intelligence to execute a maneuver that is both intellectually clinical and behaviorally absolute. A clean, permanent emotional detachment, frequently referred to in psychological circles as the empath nova. This is not an act of spontaneous hot-blooded rage, nor is it a passive-aggressive attempt to punish or manipulate the other person into changing. Instead, it is a highly regulated logical shutdown of the emotional circuit board. The super empath conducts an instantaneous internal recalculation of the relationship's true value and trajectory. They look at the data objectively, recognize that the current dynamic poses an existential threat to their own psychological and emotional ecosystem, and make a conscious decision to entirely cut off the supply of their energetic capital. This shift manifests externally, not as a loud explosion, but as a chilling, profound silence. The warmth that once defined their presence doesn't just cool down, it completely evaporates as if it never existed. They do not initiate a final dramatic confrontation. They do not offer long-winded explanations detailing why they are leaving. And they do not issue warnings or second chances. They understand that to argue is to continue negotiating, and they have reached a point where negotiation is entirely off the table. If total physical separation is immediately possible, they vanish from your life completely and irreversibly. If logistics or professional environments force them to remain in the same physical space, they seamlessly transition into the gray rock method. They strip away all personality, nuance, and emotional resonance from their interactions, presenting a facade that is as cold, unyielding, and utterly uninspiring as a pebble on the ground. They answer in monotonic monosyllables, offer no glimpses into their internal state, and refuse to mirror any emotional bait or provocations thrown their way. To the manipulator, this sudden and complete withdrawal of energy causes severe psychological whiplash. They are accustomed to dealing with individuals who can be swayed by guilt, charm, or superficial apologies. But the super empath in this state is entirely immune to those tactics. The detachment is so absolute because it occurs at the root level of their perception. The illusion of the relationship has been completely shattered, and they are now observing the manipulator through a lens of pure objective reality. They feel no urge to seek revenge, nor do they harbor active malice, because both revenge and malice require an investment of emotional energy that they are no longer willing to waste. They simply close the ledger, lock the vault, and walk away with their dignity fully intact. The psychological fallout that occurs in the wake of a super empath's permanent departure reveals a profound breakdown in the manipulator's internal architecture characterized by intense cognitive dissonance. In the economy of toxic social dynamics, a manipulator operates under a deeply flawed self-serving hypothesis. They view another person's patience, grace, and willingness to accommodate as absolute evidence of weakness or a lack of personal agency. Because the super empath spent weeks, months, or even years extending immense emotional credit, quietly absorbing friction, and offering unearned opportunities for self-correction, the manipulator becomes entirely convinced that their control is secure and that their boundaries can be stretched indefinitely. They grow comfortable in their entitlement, relying on the empath's natural tendency to heal and bridge emotional gaps. However, when the calculated transgression occurs and the super empath suddenly executes a clean, silent, and permanent emotional detachment, the manipulator is hit with an immediate wave of psychological whiplash. The sudden absolute removal of the empath's energy shatters the manipulator's social mirror. They are forced into a state of severe cognitive dissonance because they are utterly incapable of reconciling the gentle, deeply caring person they thought they controlled with the cold, unyielding, and unresponsive force that now stands before them. This creates a desperate need to make sense of the vacuum because the manipulator cannot comprehend accountability without malice. They cannot intellectually process a boundary that is enforced with clinical objectivity rather than emotional volatility. If the empath were screaming, crying, or seeking revenge, the manipulator would know exactly how to navigate the terrain. They would label the empath as unstable, irrational, or dramatic, thereby shifting the blame and maintaining their internal narrative of superiority. But the profound silence of the empath nova deprives them of this psychological leverage. There is no emotional bait to latch onto, no anger to weaponize, and no vulnerability left to exploit. In a desperate bid to regain control or restore their fractured ego, the manipulator will often cycle through a predictable sequence of behavioral tactics. They may begin with frantic love bombing, offering superficial apologies, sudden professions of insight, and grand promises of change designed to appeal to the empath's historic kindness. When these tactics fail to pierce the absolute indifference of the gray rock facade, the manipulator's confusion frequently curdles into intense frustration or projection. They will begin rewriting the history of the relationship, launching smear campaigns to paint themselves as the true victim and accusing the empath of being cold, heartless, and cruel. This projection is a defense mechanism against a terrifying internal realization. They have permanently broken something they cannot fix, and they have done so through their own deliberate actions. The total absence of closure or emotional reaction from the super empath leaves the manipulator trapped in an echo chamber of their own making, forced to confront the reality that their charm is useless, their games have failed, and they have been completely, irreversibly weighed and found wanting by the one person who truly saw through their armor.